Julian Malone had never needed much to feel at peace. After selling his outboard motor repair business and moving into a quiet, working-class neighborhood just outside of Jacksonville, he finally had what he'd always wanted. A house with a detached garage big enough to work on engines, tune up old gear, and drink his coffee in silence. It wasn't flashy, but it was solid. A wide concrete driveway, a reinforced steel door on the garage, and just enough distance from the neighbors to breathe. At 57, Julian wasn't looking for friendship, noise, or drama. He'd buried a father, survived a divorce, and closed a business without owing a dollar. He'd earned this calm. But calm, he would quickly learn, doesn't mean safe. On his second day in the new house, she appeared. Karen Barkley, a large, heavy-set woman in a stretched floral robe, dragging a small yapping dog on a leash, waving a hand like she was swatting at flies. She introduced herself as a longtime local, then launched into a rambling story about her late uncle who used to keep his old truck in that garage back when this land was split differently. Julian gave her a nod and said something polite already, sensing this wasn't going to be a one-time visit. She kept coming, always uninvited, always with a tone that walked the line between friendly and territorial. Sometimes she brought things. Pie, newspaper clippings, even a ceramic angel figurine she claimed was for good energy. Julian never let her inside. He accepted the gestures with a tight-lipped thank you and got back to work. She didn't take the hint. 3 weeks later, as Julian was reassembling a two-stroke engine on the garage workbench, he noticed movement in the corner of his eye. The side door creaked open. Karen stood in the doorway holding a plastic food container and staring around the room like she was inspecting it. "I always wondered what it looked like in here," she said with an awkward grin, stepping across the threshold before he could say a word. Julian straightened, grease on his hands, eyes narrowing. "You need to leave," he said, firm but flat. "This isn't public space." Karen blinked as if he'd slapped her. "Don't be rude, honey. I'm just being neighborly. Besides, technically, this garage used to—" Julian cut her off. "Used to doesn't mean anything now. Out." She left, but not without muttering something about people who don't appreciate community. That night, Julian replaced the side door lock and sat in silence for a long time, staring at the garage walls. Something told him she wasn't finished. He'd dealt with difficult people before, but there was something different here. Something simmering behind that artificial sweetness. Something that didn't like being told no. It didn't take long for Julian's instinct to be proven right. Less than a week after the incident with Karen barging into his garage, he came home one afternoon and immediately felt something was off. The garage door was closed just as he'd left it, but the side door, the one Karen had used before, had faint scuff marks around the handle. Fresh ones bright against the dull paint. His gut tightened. He entered cautiously, scanning the space. Nothing seemed obviously missing, but some of his tools were slightly out of place, and the old marine radio he kept on the back shelf had been moved. Julian had always been particular about his layout. Every wrench, every socket had a home. Someone had been inside. He checked the door locks again, finding small scratches near the bolt. Evidence of tampering, maybe even an attempt to pick the lock. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. Someone had violated his space. He didn't call the police. Not yet. There was no hard evidence, no clear damage, nothing they could act on. Reporting something too soon without proof could backfire, and Julian knew better than to look paranoid. Instead, he made a decision that would change everything. That same evening, Julian drove to a security supply store across town and purchased a full surveillance setup. Professional grade, not the junk advertised on late-night TV. Cameras with night vision, motion-activated alerts, audio recording, and real-time cloud backups. He spent the next 2 days installing them himself, positioning the lenses to cover the garage entrances, the driveway, and the workspace inside. No showy signs, no stickers, just quiet insurance. If someone tried again, there would be no arguing about what happened. For a while, things stayed quiet. Karen kept her distance, waving stiffly from across the street, but making no attempt to approach. Julian hoped she had finally gotten the message, but he didn't trust the piece. He stayed vigilant, checking his alerts, reviewing footage each night. Nothing suspicious showed up, until it did. It was a Thursday night just after 9 when Julian's phone buzzed on the coffee table. Motion alert, garage side entrance. His stomach dropped. He muted the TV, opened the security app, and watched as the live feed flickered into view. Karen. She was standing at the side door again, a heavy, rusted crowbar in her hand, her broad silhouette hunched and aggressive. Julian stared in disbelief as she jammed the crowbar into the frame, trying to wedge it open. He didn't move immediately. Years of experience taught him that running outside in a blind rage would only escalate things the wrong way. Instead, he grabbed his phone, called 911, and kept the operator on the line as he quietly made his way through the house toward the front, keeping his movements low and out of sight. From a narrow slit between the curtains, he saw her. Big, determined, muttering under her breath as she worked the crowbar deeper into the doorframe. Julian gave the dispatcher his address, described the situation clearly and calmly, and requested officers urgently. His heart pounded, not from fear but from adrenaline, cold and sharp. He wasn't going to confront her, not until the police arrived, but fate had other plans. Just as he was backing away from the window, he heard a metallic snap, the sound of the doorframe giving way. She was inside. Instinct kicked in. He retrieved a heavy flashlight from the hallway shelf, a solid steel mag light that could double as a baton if necessary. He slipped out the back door and circled around, careful not to be seen. From the shadows, he heard her cursing loudly inside the garage, tossing items aside, her heavy steps echoing. And then, unbelievably, she emerged, staggering out of the garage, crowbar still in hand, her face twisted in rage. She spotted him before he could retreat fully into the darkness. With a shriek that sounded almost feral, she rushed toward him, swinging the crowbar high above her head. Julian barely sidestepped the first blow, the crowbar slicing the air inches from his temple. He didn't try to tackle her. He didn't raise the flashlight. He shouted loud and clear for her to stop, backing away toward the main driveway where he knew the cameras had the clearest view. She kept coming, stumbling, shouting something incoherent about stealing her property and making her life hell. It wasn't until the wail of approaching sirens cut through the night that she hesitated, looked around, and realized she was trapped. The police arrived moments later, tires screeching as they pulled into the driveway, floodlights sweeping over the chaotic scene. Karen dropped the crowbar, raising her hands halfway in a pathetic attempt at innocence, but the damage was already done. Officers ordered her to the ground, cuffing her with minimal resistance. Julian stood still, heart hammering, forcing himself to breathe slowly to keep his voice steady as he explained everything to the lead officer. Within minutes, they were reviewing the live footage from his phone. There was no ambiguity. The break-in, the vandalism, the attempted assault, all captured clearly with Karen's face illuminated in stark detail. She tried to lie, of course, claimed she had gotten confused and thought she was at her sister's house, that she was just trying to get something back that was hers. None of it made sense. The officers weren't buying it. One of them pulled Julian aside, speaking in a low voice. "You did the right thing, Mr. Malone. Most folks, they panic, they try to fight, they end up the ones getting sued or worse. You stayed calm, got evidence. That's how you survive people like her." Julian nodded, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and weariness. He hadn't wanted a fight. He hadn't wanted a feud. All he had wanted was a quiet life, a garage, a place to breathe. Now, standing in the glow of red and blue lights, watching Karen being loaded into the back of the cruiser, he realized just how fast peace could be shattered by someone too entitled, too angry to take a simple no for an answer. And deep down, he knew this wasn't over yet. People like Karen didn't disappear quietly. They left wreckage behind. The days that followed were a mixture of uneasy silence and the kind of cold, lingering tension that settled deep into the bones. Karen Barkley had been charged with trespassing and attempted assault, but she had not spent more than a few hours in holding before posting bail. Julian knew it would happen. He wasn't naive. In America, even with evidence stacked against someone, unless you were caught holding something illegal or ran from police, jail time didn't come easily on a first offense. Still, part of him had hoped. Hoped that seeing those handcuffs on her wrists, hearing the police read her rights would be enough to scare her off for good. He should have known better. 3 days after her arrest, Julian noticed her standing across the street, arms crossed, an unlit cigarette dangling from her lips, just staring at his house. No words, no gestures, just standing there for an hour straight, like she was waiting for him to break first. He ignored her. Let her stew. His job now wasn't to escalate, but to outlast. He kept the cameras rolling, made backups every night, checked the locks twice before bed. Life went on, carefully, methodically. He refused to be bullied out of his own property. But Karen wasn't finished. She was just getting creative. The first warning shot came in the form of a city code violation notice pinned to his mailbox. According to the paper, a complaint had been filed, claiming Julian's garage was being operated as an unlicensed business, a zoning violation for a residential property. It was laughable, of course. Julian wasn't running a business anymore. Fixing an engine or two in his own garage on his own time wasn't illegal. He gathered his permits, receipts from when he shut down his former company, and prepared to defend himself. At the city office, the clerk barely looked up from her desk before waving him off. "We get these nuisance complaints all the time," she said, sliding his paperwork into a folder. "You're fine. We'll dismiss it after an inspection." Julian scheduled the inspection for the earliest slot available and went home, feeling simultaneously relieved and furious. Karen was trying to drown him in paperwork, hoping he'd slip, hoping the city would do the dirty work she couldn't. Then came the notes. Slipped under his door at night. Written in shaky cursive with big childish loops, the notes accused him of everything from stealing from a widow to polluting the community with toxic chemicals. Julian photographed every one and logged them in a folder, resisting the urge to respond. They were crude, almost laughable, but he knew better than to dismiss them. Paper trails mattered. One night, he caught her on camera again, skulking up to the garage door and trying to jam what looked like a wad of chewed gum into the lock. The next morning, the lock was sticky, nearly unusable. He replaced it for the second time in a month and forwarded the footage to the officer handling her case. The officer responded with a short message. "Document everything. We're building a pattern." Julian took that advice seriously. He created a thick binder, each incident dated, cross-referenced with video and photos. Still, nothing prepared him for what happened next. A Thursday afternoon, humid and thick with the smell of rain, Julian heard a commotion from the driveway. Peering through the kitchen window, he saw a group of people gathered at the curb. Karen was at the center, dramatically waving her arms and pointing toward his house, her voice rising above the others. Julian recognized two neighbors from down the street, faces he barely knew beyond a nod at the mailbox. One of them, a wiry man with a baseball cap pulled low, crossed his arms and shook his head as Karen spoke. Another neighbor, an older woman, looked toward Julian's house with visible discomfort. Julian stepped onto his front porch, crossing his arms and standing still, saying nothing. Karen spotted him immediately and bellowed, "There he is! That's the man I've been telling you about, harboring dangerous equipment, polluting our neighborhood. He doesn't belong here." The crowd shifted awkwardly, some muttering, others glancing away. It wasn't a mob, but it was a spectacle. And that was all Karen needed, the optics of conflict. Julian didn't engage. He turned on his heel and walked back inside, closing the door with deliberate calm. He heard the murmurs, the shuffling feet, as the group slowly dispersed. When he reviewed the security footage later, he caught Karen lingering at the edge of his property long after the others had left, her face contorted in frustration. The following morning, 2 of his garbage bins were overturned, their contents scattered across the driveway and halfway into the street. It wasn't random. The garbage had been torn open, the contents deliberately strewn about. A dead raccoon, bloated and buzzing with flies, had been dumped on top of the pile. Julian stared at the mess for a long time, rage simmering under the surface. He knew who had done it. He knew he couldn't prove it. Not yet. The cameras hadn't caught the act itself, just the aftermath. Karen was learning. She was getting smarter, working under the cover of dark corners and loopholes. Julian spent 2 hours cleaning up, wearing thick gloves and a mask, working in silence. He called the waste management department to report the incident, documented the mess with photographs, logged the time and date. No yelling, no drama, just methodical survival. By the end of the week, Julian noticed his mail arriving suspiciously late. Soaked through, bent, some pieces missing entirely. Bills, insurance notices, legal correspondence, things that mattered. He installed a lockbox for his incoming mail and began tracking deliveries. He reported the suspicious activity to the postal inspector, explaining the pattern. The inspector listened carefully and promised an investigation. Another thread, another piece of the net tightening around Karen, whether she realized it or not. The real breaking point came one humid Saturday morning when Julian, while checking his backyard fence, found a crude message spray-painted in red across the wooden panels. "Get out!" The letters were uneven, rushed, dripping in the heat. Julian stood there for a long moment, the sun rising behind him, casting his shadow long and dark against the stained wood. He didn't panic. He didn't rage. He went inside, pulled out his camera, took slow, careful pictures of the graffiti from every angle. He filed a new report, sent it to the investigating officer, backed up the images to 3 separate locations. When the officer visited later that afternoon, Julian showed him the growing evidence binder. The officer whistled low under his breath. "This is textbook harassment," he said, flipping through the pages. "She's getting desperate." Julian nodded. He wasn't afraid of Karen Barkley. He was angry, not just at her, but at the exhausting, calculated nature of her campaign. She wasn't attacking with fists or knives, she was attacking with paper cuts and whispers and dirt under the nails. Death by 1,000 petty wounds. But he was ready. Every action she took only built his case stronger, and he was prepared to see it through to the end. Whatever it took. Julian understood by now that waiting for Karen to simply exhaust herself was a fantasy. She wasn't operating on logic, and she wasn't going to stop because it made sense. She was escalating, not retreating. And he realized that playing defense alone would only stretch the agony out indefinitely. He needed leverage. That Sunday morning, after another night of restless sleep, punctuated by the sound of Karen's heavy steps pacing up and down the sidewalk, Julian decided to stop acting like a man under siege and start acting like a man preparing for war. But the legal kind, the smart kind, the kind that people like Karen never saw coming until it was too late. The first thing he did was set up a formal consultation with a civil attorney who specialized in harassment and private nuisance cases. He didn't rush in blustering about injustice. He arrived with a methodical binder of evidence, neatly tabbed and annotated, a timeline of every incident, every police report, every photograph. The lawyer, a crisp, calculating woman named Marla Trent, flipped through the file in growing interest as Julian explained, without dramatics, what had been happening. When he finished, she closed the binder slowly and looked him in the eye. "You have enough to crush her," she said flatly. "But you have to be ready. Once we push this into court, it's going public. She's going to lash out before it gets better." Julian nodded. He was more than ready. He retained Marla on the spot, signing the necessary forms, agreeing to the next steps. A cease and desist order followed by a civil suit for damages if the harassment continued. No half measures, no polite warnings. Just clean, deliberate action. While Marla drafted the paperwork, Julian reinforced his defenses. He added more cameras, this time hidden ones that covered the blind spots Karen might exploit. He upgraded his locks, his mailbox, even reinforced his garage doors with internal braces. The house began to resemble a quiet fortress, not in a showy way, but in the way a man fortifies against a storm he knows will come sooner or later. Meanwhile, Karen didn't disappoint. A week after the graffiti incident, Julian came home to find a yard sign hammered into the grass just beyond his property line. It was handmade, the letters jagged and red. "Dangerous man lives here." Beneath it, crude drawings of flames and broken windows. Julian took pictures, didn't touch the sign, and called the police again. The responding officer shook his head in disgust but could only promise to file another report. They were building a case, yes, but the slow wheels of bureaucracy turned at their own pace, and Karen seemed to know exactly how far she could push without immediate consequences. The cease and desist order arrived at Karen's door 2 days later, hand-delivered by a county process server. Julian watched from his window as she tore the envelope open, read the contents, and crumpled the papers in her thick, trembling hands. Her face, already red from the heat, darkened to an almost purplish hue. She threw the crumpled paper on the ground and stomped it into the sidewalk before storming back into her house, slamming the door hard enough that the windows on Julian's porch rattled. For a brief moment, Julian allowed himself hope that maybe, This would force her to back off. That night was quiet. No footsteps on the sidewalk, no notes, no trash in the yard. He slept a full 6 hours uninterrupted for the first time in weeks. But Karen's silence wasn't surrender. It was the slow drawing back of a predator before the next strike. 2 nights later, well past midnight, Julian's motion sensors triggered again. He tapped open the live feed, expecting maybe the usual, a tossed piece of garbage, some petty vandalism. What he saw froze the blood in his veins. Karen, dressed in dark clothes, was crouching beside his garage, and beside her were 2 objects, a gas can and a bundle of rags. Julian's hands moved before his mind could catch up. Calling 911, his voice low and urgent, explaining exactly what was happening while keeping one eye on the screen. Karen soaked the rags, stuffed them into a metal canister, and produced what looked like a lighter. Julian didn't wait. Without turning on any exterior lights to alert her, he stepped into the hallway, pulled the main circuit breaker switch that killed all power to the outside outlets and motion lights. Karen, now fumbling in the dark, seemed to hesitate, confused. The police sirens pierced the night within minutes, floodlights flashing against the front of the house. Karen tried to scramble away but tripped over her own feet and landed heavily in the flower bed. The officers descended on her before she could regain her footing, hauling her up roughly and securing her in cuffs once again. This time, there were no mumbled excuses about mistaken identity, no pathetic pleas of confusion. She howled and cursed, spitting insults at Julian's darkened windows as the officers dragged her toward the patrol car. Julian stood inside, calm, stone-faced, refusing to rise to the bait. Everything she had done was recorded. This wasn't just vandalism anymore, it was attempted arson, it was a felony. At the station later, while giving his statement, Julian learned that in addition to the charges already pending, Karen would now be facing felony charges that could actually carry real jail time. No more overnight releases, no more minor citations. This was serious. It was everything Julian had worked for, patiently documenting, preparing, surviving. Yet standing there under the sterile fluorescent lights, Julian didn't feel triumphant. He felt tired. Tired of the games, tired of being forced to live like a man at war for daring to mind his own business. Karen had shown how much damage one unstable, malicious person could inflict just by refusing to take no for an answer. But Julian also felt something stronger than exhaustion. Resolve. He hadn't broken. He hadn't lashed out. He had handled it the only way that truly wins in the long run, with evidence, with law, and with patience. The storm wasn't over yet, but the tide had turned, and Julian, battered but unbending, was still standing. Julian thought Karen's arrest for attempted arson would finally slam the door shut on the madness that had infected his life for the past 2 months. He thought the legal system, with its cold precision and heavy punishments, would be enough to break through even her thick skull and make her understand that there were real consequences to her actions. For a few days, it even seemed like he was right. The neighborhood felt lighter, the street quieter. Karen's house remained dark at night, her mailbox stuffed with uncollected junk mail, her front yard overgrown and littered with newspapers and debris. It was as if she had simply evaporated into thin air. And for the first time since moving into the neighborhood, Julian started to imagine a future without having to check his cameras every morning, without backing into his driveway so he could keep an eye on the road, without feeling that permanent coil of tension wound tight in his gut. But Karen wasn't gone. She was regrouping. One afternoon, Julian received a thick envelope in the mail, this one bearing no return address. Inside, printed on cheap copier paper, were copies of anonymous complaints filed against him to various county offices. Zoning violations, environmental hazards, noise complaints, accusations of operating an illegal business from his residence, even a fabricated report claiming that Julian was stockpiling dangerous chemicals in his garage. Some of them had already been dismissed by the offices involved, but several were marked pending investigation, meaning he would be dealing with inspectors, questionnaires, and possible citations in the coming weeks. It didn't take a genius to figure out who was behind it. Karen had weaponized the system itself against him. Julian knew what he had to do. No anger, no impulsive reactions. He gathered the documents, scanned them into his growing digital archive, and forwarded copies to his lawyer, Marla Trent. Within 24 hours, Marla had filed for an emergency protective order against Karen, expanding the existing restraining order to include third-party harassment via false reports. It wouldn't stop the bureaucratic process already set in motion, but it would paint a clear picture for the judge if things escalated further. It wasn't just the paperwork. Karen had recruited others. A week later, Julian found himself at the center of another coordinated effort. Flyers appeared overnight on telephone poles in neighbors' mailboxes and taped to stop signs. Bright red ink screamed accusations. "Dangerous man among us!" With a grainy, zoomed-in photo of Julian working in his garage beneath it. The flyer accused him of criminal activity, of harboring hazardous materials, and encouraged residents to demand his removal for the safety of the community. It was surreal seeing himself painted as the villain in a story where he had only ever wanted to be left alone. Some neighbors simply shook their heads and shrugged. They'd seen enough of Karen's antics to distrust anything with her stink on it, but others, the ones who didn't know him personally, began treating Julian differently. Sideways glances, conversations that abruptly stopped when he walked by. Packages left on his porch were stolen twice in the same week, and the next time he mowed his lawn, he caught a woman taking pictures of him from across the street. Julian didn't break. He reinforced his position. He installed more motion lights, added a second locked gate to the side entrance of the property, and placed laminated notices along the fence line warning against trespassing and illegal surveillance. Every piece of mail that arrived suspiciously damaged or late was logged and photographed. He was no longer just defending himself. He was building a legal wall so high and solid that even Karen's lies couldn't climb over it. It escalated again when one night, while Julian sat reading on his back porch, his property sensors triggered. He rose carefully, moving inside to check the feeds. He saw two figures, teenagers by their size and movement, trying to loosen the bolts on his mailbox post with a wrench. He called the police immediately, reporting vandalism in progress. When the officers arrived and confronted the teens, it didn't take much pressure for them to crack. They had been offered $50 and free gas money by a woman fitting Karen's description to mess with the guy who hates the neighborhood. The officers filed their reports, and Marla immediately filed a motion to include criminal solicitation, charges against Karen in the civil case. The walls were closing in on her, but she wasn't done squirming yet. A few nights later, Julian received a knock at his door. Not aggressive, not frantic, but deliberate. A uniformed city inspector stood there, clipboard in hand. Julian recognized the department emblem, Health and Safety. The inspector apologized but said they had to perform an inspection based on a credible tip about improperly stored hazardous waste. Julian said nothing, simply stepping aside and allowing the inspector in. It took all of 5 minutes for the inspector to realize the tip was pure fiction. He left with a handshake and a grimace, promising to document the false complaint officially, another thread tightening around Karen's neck. Marla advised Julian to remain patient. "This," she said during one of their meetings, tapping a thick file of documents on the table, "is how we destroy her, not with noise, with proof, with weight. When we walk into court, the judge is going to see a woman who weaponized every institution she could touch. And she's going to pay for it." Still, even patience had its price. Julian's days became a constant low thrum of anxiety. Even simple errands felt suspicious. Every strange car parked too long on the street sent prickles up his spine. Even sleeping became strategic. Doors double-checked, windows locked, cameras tilted and rechecked. He lived like a soldier in hostile territory, not because he was afraid of physical harm. He knew Karen was too much of a coward for that, but because reputation, once damaged, was harder to mend than any broken window. And yet, Julian endured, methodical, unflinching. He documented everything. He didn't retaliate. He never gave Karen the emotional explosion she so clearly craved. When the final incident of the second escalation came, it was almost anticlimactic. Another process server arrived at Julian's door, this time delivering a countersuit from Karen herself, accusing him of harassment, defamation, and emotional terrorism. Julian read the paper slowly, carefully, then smiled grimly. It was a desperate move, a bluff designed to intimidate or force a settlement. It wouldn't work. His counter-evidence was a fortress compared to her paper-thin accusations. He handed the documents to Marla the next morning without a word. She glanced through them, then looked up at him with a rare smile. "Good," she said. Now it's her turn to explain herself under oath. Julian nodded. The battle had never been about winning arguments or scoring points in public. It had always been about outlasting her chaos, surviving her madness, and dragging her into the one arena where lies didn't last: a courtroom. And now, at last, they were almost there. The courthouse smelled of old paper and worn carpet, a quiet, humming sort of place where people came to either destroy or defend their lives. Julian sat on the hard bench outside the courtroom, his hands resting calmly on his knees, watching as Karen Barkley shuffled past him, her lawyer trailing behind her like a funeral procession. She looked smaller somehow, less imposing than she had in all those months of screaming, vandalizing, threatening. There were dark bags under her eyes, her complexion sallow and blotchy, her clothes wrinkled and clinging uncomfortably to her heavy frame. She didn't look at him. She didn't have the nerve anymore. Maybe somewhere deep inside she knew that today would end everything she had built out of lies. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was clinical, sterile, almost boring to an outsider. But Julian felt the electricity under it all, the tension that buzzed between the chairs and microphones and legal pads. Marla sat beside him, her demeanor sharp and unbothered, a thick file of meticulously prepared evidence on the table in front of her. Across the aisle, Karen's attorney, a tired-looking man with an outdated suit and a stack of disorganized notes, whispered fiercely into Karen's ear as she fidgeted with her bracelets and avoided eye contact with everyone. The judge, a stern woman with steel-gray hair and an expression like a thundercloud about to burst, entered and called the proceedings to order. What followed wasn't a fiery courtroom drama, but a slow, brutal dismantling. Marla laid out the case with surgical precision, each piece of evidence presented not for drama, but for cumulative weight. The police reports, the video footage of Karen breaking into the garage with a crowbar, the attempted arson recorded by hidden cameras, the forged flyers, the vandalism, the harassment of delivery workers, the solicitation of teenagers to damage private property, and, finally, the false counterclaims she had filed in an attempt to muddy the waters. Karen's attorney tried, at first, to object, to deflect, to paint Julian as an unfriendly neighbor who had overreacted to a series of misunderstandings. But with every piece of documentation, every photograph, every sworn statement, the defense crumbled a little more. The judge asked direct, cutting questions. Why had Karen approached his garage with a weapon? Why were there multiple verified false complaints traced back to her address? Why did the teenagers identify her as the person who paid them to vandalize? The answers, when they came, were stammered, disjointed, and pitiful. Karen's attempt to portray herself as a confused, mentally overwhelmed woman collapsed completely when Marla presented the footage of her planting a makeshift incendiary device by Julian's garage. The room went completely silent as the judge watched the footage, her face tightening with every frame. When it ended, there was no question left to ask about intent. Karen was called to the stand. She was visibly sweating now, her hands shaking as she tried to explain away months of deliberate, malicious behavior. She blamed grief, menopause, medications, loneliness, anything she could think of to garner sympathy. But sympathy was in short supply in that courtroom, especially when Marla calmly asked whether loneliness could explain multiple documented acts of property destruction, criminal solicitation, and filing false reports under penalty of perjury. Karen had no answer. When Julian was called to the stand, he didn't make speeches. He simply confirmed facts. Yes, he had moved into the neighborhood for peace and quiet. No, he had not provoked Karen. Yes, he had installed security cameras after the first signs of trouble. No, he had never retaliated or sought conflict. He answered each question clearly and steadily, making it impossible for even the defense to twist his words. Julian didn't come off as a vigilante or a troublemaker. He came off exactly as he was, a man who had been systematically targeted and who had defended himself with patience, intelligence, and restraint. After closing statements, the judge recessed briefly to review the evidence. Julian sat there, still as a stone, as Karen wrung her hands and whispered desperately to her lawyer. When the judge returned, the verdict was swift and decisive. The court found in favor of Julian on every count. Karen was ordered to pay significant financial damages for harassment, defamation, emotional distress, and property destruction. Furthermore, a permanent protective injunction was issued, forbidding her from coming within 500 feet of Julian's property or contacting him in any way, directly or through third parties. But it didn't end there. The judge referred the matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution based on the attempted arson and the documented acts of vandalism and solicitation. Karen wasn't just facing fines and court orders now, she was facing real jail time. As the courtroom emptied, Karen sat frozen in her chair, her face slack with shock. Julian didn't look at her. There was no satisfaction in seeing her broken like that, no victory in her downfall. There was only the clean, quiet relief of survival. He gathered his things, shook Marla's hand firmly, and walked out into the late afternoon sun without looking back. Outside, the air felt different. Not lighter exactly, but freer. Like a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying had been peeled off his back. The street noises, car horns, children playing, birds squabbling in the trees, sounded normal again, not like the distant echoes of a battlefield. Julian knew the scars of the past months would linger. Trust was not something easily repaired once it had been so thoroughly abused. He would always check over his shoulder a little more carefully now. He would always lock his doors twice, maybe even 3 times, but he had survived. He had defended what was his without becoming what he hated. In a world that often demanded you choose between becoming a victim or becoming a monster, Julian Malone had chosen the harder path, to stand firm, to endure, to win the right way, and that, in the end, was the only victory that mattered. Life after Karen didn't return to normal overnight. There were days when Julian still caught himself glancing at the driveway cameras out of habit, or pausing to listen for the heavy stomp of her feet across the street. Old habits died hard when you spent months living in a siege mentality. But over time, the silence began to stretch longer between those moments of tension. The neighborhood, which had once seemed like a minefield of whispered accusations and sideways glances, started to feel less hostile. Some neighbors, the ones who had been quick to believe the worst, made small gestures of reconciliation. A nod over a hedge, a cautious wave from a porch. Julian accepted them without enthusiasm or bitterness. He wasn't interested in grudges, he was interested in peace. Karen's house went on the market barely 3 weeks after the verdict. The real estate agent tried to dress it up in the listings. Charming fixer-upper with potential. But everyone knew the truth. Even with a fresh coat of paint and an aggressively cheerful welcome mat, it sat empty, the for sale sign swaying in the breeze. Buyers came and went, peering in the windows, wandering the overgrown backyard, asking quiet questions that never reached Julian's ears. In the end, it didn't matter who bought it. As long as it wasn't her, he could live with anything. For Julian, the real recovery wasn't about the neighborhood at all. It was about reclaiming his own life, inch by inch, in ways that seemed almost absurdly small but meant everything. He opened the garage doors wide again while he worked, letting the sound of classic rock and the scent of oil and metal drift into the warm air. He drank his morning coffee on the front steps instead of hiding in the backyard. He took longer walks around the block without the tight knot of dread sitting in his stomach. He even found himself chatting briefly with some of the neighbors who had once looked at him with suspicion, accepting their tentative conversations not out of need but out of simple human courtesy. The scars Karen had left weren't invisible. Julian doubted he would ever again fully trust a stranger the way he had before she walked into his life, heavy and smiling and rotten underneath the surface. But that was the reality of survival. You didn't come through fire unchanged. You carried the heat with you in your bones. The trick was learning to live with it without letting it consume you. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the street in a soft, golden hue, Julian locked up the garage, leaned against the doorframe, and watched the world settle into itself. There were kids riding bikes, a dog barking 3 houses down, the ordinary clatter and thrum of a place slowly forgetting its troubles. He let himself smile, just a little, and for the first time in what felt like forever, it wasn't a smile weighed down by caution or bitterness. It was simple, honest. A man at peace because he had fought for it and won.